Good morning, and great pleasure to see all of you come back. It's always a good test of a conference if they return on the Sunday. So, yes, ancient evidence for the ancient uses of electrical phenomena. What I'd like to say first is a couple of points. To begin with, I make it clear I'm not a scientist. I'm more of a cultural historian interested in alternative theories about the origins of civilization, civilization meaning cities. And some of what I'm about to say I published in my book, Approaching Chaos, in 2010, which was based on more than 10 years of research. Otherwise, the closest that I can claim to Electric Universe is possibly a 19th century ancestor, Joshua King, a senior wrangler, president of his college in Cambridge, who held the same chair of Lucasian mathematics as Sir Isaac Newton. Not many people can claim this descendancy. And Stephen Hawking. And I will come back to Newton at the end. But sadly, it has to be said, genetics haven't helped me that much. So please forgive me if I make any mistakes with the science. The second point is that I have found out through my research that the ancients were not primitive or backward in the sense that we might understand it. In many ways, they were more evolved than us, more advanced. They could do things that we can't today. How they were able to do these things is broadly open to speculation, but they deserve our respect and our interest. So what I want to do this morning is briefly plant some ideas in your heads, open up the discussion so that we can think about learning stuff from the ancients, because they were practical people. Even their use of the woo-woo was for practical reasons. And I believe that they were more than aware of how to use electrical phenomena, and that there is evidence for this in the following three areas. A sort of macro scale, taking into account construction, geodesy, the effect on the land. A more personal, human microscale, personal adornment, jewelry, ritual, in involving healing. And then, most controversially, the very stuff of life, a submolecular level. And I'll explain later what I mean by that. Now, starting with the land, one of the most impressive monuments of the ancients that we would struggle to build with today is the Great Pyramid at Giza in Egypt. And where best to begin than with the great machine itself? For most of its existence, it has been the largest man-made construction on the planet. The sheer scale and precision of it are breathtaking. Built possibly over 4,000 years ago, it may be older, who knows. It rises 481 feet, covers an area of nearly 600,000 square feet, contains 2.3 million stones, some of which weigh up to 70 tons. And there are cranes in this world today that can't really lift 70 tons, including 144,000 casing stones, which are flat to an accuracy of 1/100th of an inch. The alignment of the pyramid facing true north has only a 3/60th degree of error, 3/60th degree, and it is positioned in the center of the planet's biggest landmass. Some claim that it is a scale model of the northern hemisphere of the Earth, as well as being one of the three pyramids that mirror Orion's belt, as Adrian has written about in his Orion Mysteries with Robert Bauval. The 70-ton stones are granite and likely to have come from the quarry in Aswan, over 500 miles away, not on rollers. It may well be that the limestone casing stones, which are now largely missing, were actually cast in situ using an ancient form of geopolymer. And believe it or not, Professor Robert Temple, from whom you heard last night, has the patent for that. Inside the pyramid, there are various chambers and passages, King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, Grand Gallery, etc., shafts that possibly align with star systems. Now, there are several points to note about the interior. There is no internal decoration anywhere inside it. No carvings, no paintings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate its purpose. Admittedly, the King's Chamber contains a large person-sized granite coffer, but apart from that, all we have is speculation by modern-day Egyptologists that this was built as a tomb. There is more to support the idea that it was built as a machine. Indeed, there are those who believe that the interconnected internal cavities resemble some kind of resonator, waveguide, harmonic capacitor antenna system. And in particular, it seems to have been specifically designed with vibration in mind. Now, if we focus in on one area in particular, we can see that the design of the King's Chamber does not entirely make sense. What is odd about it is that the floor is not connected to the walls, this bit here. That's an actual sectional diagram that shows how it's constructed. And there are also, above the ceiling, there are these are the 70-ton granite megaliths, and they are hidden. When you're in the King's Chamber, you have no idea that these are above you. And there was once an idea that they were to do with relieving the stress weight above the chamber, but that view has now been discredited. And more notice has been taken of the fact that there are deliberate chunks taken out of these stones. This image doesn't show that. The conclusion that many have come to is that the whole assembly has been deliberately designed to freely resonate, to vibrate, and that even the gouges make sense as a way of tuning the stones to the correct frequency. The choice of granite, with its high contents of quartz and piezoelectric properties, is thus relevant. One person who has reached these opinions is engineer Chris Dunn. Chris Dunn is in every sense a practical man. Born in Manchester, UK, he has lived most of his working life in the US, designing machine tools for big American companies. He understands about the practicalities of precision work and the limits of materials. And he has been so impressed by what he has observed in the Egyptian Great Pyramid that he is convinced it was a giant machine to generate electrical energy. He describes the pyramid as acting like a coupled oscillator, which will draw energy from the source so long as the source continues to vibrate. The source of this energy, he believes, is a Schumann resonance, which I think Patrick McManaway is going to talk about later. He cites damage in the King's Chamber as an indication of a powerful explosion, the result of the machine malfunctioning and not caused by earthquakes because there are no cracks in the layers below this. I won't go into all the details of Chris's propositions because they are all in his book, Giza Power Plant, but I can give any of you links to it later if you want to follow that up. Now, even Chris is somewhat baffled by the question of how did they do it? How did they build such a monolith? Surely not with the use of thousands of slaves, copper tools, hemp rope, and they didn't cart 70-ton blocks from Aswan quarry on wooden rollers. Remember, in today's context, this would be a major engineering feat, moving around 70-ton blocks. Chris is convinced that they had something more than copper available to them in terms of tools, and that they had mechanical devices. He agrees with the 19th century archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who did much of the original work on Egypt, that the Egyptians had mechanical drills, lathes, and saws. It was Petrie who discovered examples of discarded out drill cores with evidence of striation marks left by the drilling. And Chris Dunn has also identified the mistakes of where stones show evidence of over-drilling, of not removing the cutting device in time. But Chris also thought the Egyptians had something more. And for an insight into what this something more might be, and an explanation of how did they do it, Chris turned to the work of someone much closer to us in time, to a Latvian immigrant who arrived in the USA before the Second World War by the name of Ed Līdzkalnis. What this man was able to achieve single-handedly and without any heavy machinery, was the construction in Florida of a fantasy site called Coral Castle, where he used giant blocks of coral, some of which weighed up to 22 tons each. Now, Līdzkalnis was highly secretive. No one observed him when cutting and moving stone. He did it all alone, dying without imparting his secrets. He did, however, claim to leave some clues in his writings on magnetic currents, and he also claimed to have discovered the secrets of the Egyptians, based on the Earth being a giant magnet, with a flow of magnets in opposite directions, in and out of both poles, like twisted Birkeland currents. He had strong views on magnetism. I'm not saying I share them, but he had strong views on magnetism, to the point of dismissing electrons and stating that he would have preferred electricity to have been called magneticity. He even thought that an excess of magnets coming from the sun and hitting the Earth more on the east side than the west is what causes the Earth to rotate. Now, in simple terms, what Līdzkalnis may have been able to do was reverse the magnetic poles in the rock. And by changing its polarities, he could render rock, however big, not just weightless, but also easier to cut. The conclusion that Chris Dunn came to after visiting Līdzkalnis' workshop, which is now on public display, is that he used a combination of low-frequency resonance and electromagnetism. Chris observed a number of radio receivers and tuners in the workshop, and rare photographs of Līdzkalnis show a relatively flimsy tripod, given the weight of the stones it's supposed to have, with a mysterious box on the top. And Chris suggests that lead scanning was able to vibrate the coral rock as it's at its resonant frequency by using infrasound, and then reverse the magnetic poles in the rock using an electromagnetic field. And it has to be said, something similar has been achieved by Canadian inventor John Hutchison, known as the Hutchison effect. He too has been able to levitate objects using electromagnetism and sound waves. And it has to be said that sonic drilling using infrasonic energy is a well-known technique for making perfect holes in granite stone, using only a very small amount of power. And I quote from the 1952 edition of Popular Mechanics, The Magic of Silent Sound. Returning to Egypt, we know that sound was important to their culture. For example, they had the concept of the djed, a cosmic vibration animating all matter, bringing it to life. The djed is present in the djed pillar. These are examples of djed pillars, here and here, this one here. And the function of this I will refer to again later. The djed is also found in the name of one of the Egyptian gods that Adrian was talking about yesterday, Thoth or Thoth, also known as Hermes, who had the role of being the originator of sound, of vibration, which set all matter into motion. And then there are the passages in the Hermetica, the ancient book of Egyptian wisdom, which Adrian also referred to. Very similar to the Bible's Genesis chapters, the Hermetica talks of the light uttering a word which calmed the chaotic waters, and of Atum's word falling on fertile waters, making them pregnant with all forms, so vibration, sound. And it is interesting to compare these concepts with the discovery in the 18th century of cymatics, of how sound produces shapes. All these patterns can be reproduced using specific sounds. It is alleged by some that even certain Egyptian hieroglyphs can be created in this way. But I digress. For now, all we have is evidence of what the Egyptians could achieve in terms of the pyramids, the giant statues, the precision, the use of hard stone like granite. And while you ponder on what methods these Egyptians might have used, I would like to mention some ideas about purpose. What was the Great Pyramid built for? What need did the Egyptians have for a machine producing a giant energy field? After all, they didn't live like we did. They didn't have the need for toasters and internet and things in the same way. As I've already said, this pyramid, not built as a royal tomb. Indeed, I believe we have to stop thinking for a moment on a human level and understand the Great Pyramid in terms of a much greater scale. I think the location of the pyramid is no coincidence, middle of the largest landmass, and on what was once considered to be the planetary zero meridian, an honour held today by Greenwich and London, and geodetically connected into a vast planetary grid of telluric currents. I think Edwin Carl is going to talk more about that today and possibly again tomorrow. The role of the Great Pyramid ties in with the Egyptians' view of themselves as being the temple of the world. As it says in the Hermetica, Egypt is the image of the heavens. The whole cosmos dwells here, the home of spirituality. As we heard yesterday, above, so below. And part of that role of the temple was channeling the flow of earth energies. The Egyptians had an understanding of the flow of qi, of what the Chinese today call feng shui. And one can think of this system as being like the acupuncture for the land, with markers such as megalithic stones and ancient Egyptian obelisks used in the same way, like a giant marker, a puncture needle into the ground. And the purpose of this was partly to improve the fertility of the land. The giant pyramid was possibly then a giant booster, a big booster of energy. And we know from modern day experiments when plant seeds are exposed to electrical fields that they improve their yield. So we can only imagine how effective a Great Pyramid might have been, with energy drawn up from the ground through the pyramid, magnified and then projected through a golden capstone at the top. The whole structure would have created a very powerful electromagnetic force. And elsewhere in the world, on a smaller scale, we find other megalithic sites which may have had a similar function. Even Stonehenge could have been more than a calendar. Brittany in western France is littered with megaliths of all kinds. Dolmens, stone rows, circles, menhirs, and they all date back more than 5,000 years. Near Karnak, we find miles of rows of megaliths. And was their purpose all to focus the flow of energy out into the land? And as Adrian has been saying, tomorrow some of you are going to visit Avebury, where there's an example of one of these stone avenues. And in Scotland, there's the example of the Broch, extraordinary dry stone wall towers. I mean, you can just see how big this is. This is human-scale door. This is massive. With vitrified interiors dating back to Neolithic times. Were these too built to focus powerful vortices and stimulate fertility in the land? And what about the vitrification? Is that evidence of the use of plasma? Skara Brae in the Orkneys is another example of an ancient Neolithic site with evidence of unexplained high temperatures. And as an aside, is it a matter of total speculation, but is it a coincidence that Stonehenge manifests 56 Aubrey holes, 56 being the number of filaments that plasma can produce? Tomorrow, some of those you who visit the Great Henges at Avebury, the largest stone circle in Europe, will be invited to consider whether or not plasma was involved. So while the Great Pyramid of Giza may have had a more general purpose, many smaller pyramids in Egypt, return to Egypt, that did involve, indeed, the burial of a pharaoh, which had a more human function. Because it was the ambition of every pharaoh to celebrate something called the Heb-Sed festival, and for that he needed a pyramid. This very important, once-in-a-lifetime event has hints of the use of electricity, which I will explain. First, a bit more about the event itself. Sometimes called a Pharaoh's Jubilee, it was to a great extent, this was the event he dedicated his entire life to. Even his title, Pharaoh, could have been a Greek corruption of the name of the place where he went to prepare himself for the Heb-Sed festival. It's called the Per Ul, which means house of foundation, Per Ul. It was here that the pharaoh underwent rigorous mental and physical training, where he was taught to face his deepest fears. For what the pharaoh had to endure during the Heb-Sed festival was a terrifying ordeal, and one which could quite literally kill him. It was based on the myth of Osiris, which Adrian referred to yesterday, in which the god is resurrected after being dead for 3 days. And so the pharaoh was similarly obliged to be buried, not dead, but alive for 3 days. The most famous example of a Heb-Sed festival complex can be found at Saqqara, with its pyramid and festival court. It is at Saqqara that there are texts written on the inside of the pyramid that tell us something about the ritual that took place here. Dr. Jeremy Nadler, an Oxford academic, has reinterpreted these as being shamanic texts. We call them the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but the Egyptians called them the coming forth by day. And before I go into a bit more detail about these texts, I would like to say a little bit about the Heb-Sed festival itself. It was divided into public and secret parts. In the public part, people came from all over Egypt to witness the pharaoh running around a courtyard to prove that he was physically fit. And then after consuming a ritual meal called the hetep, the pharaoh entered the pyramid for the secret part. And here he lay on a special Heb-Sed festival bed, or in a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite inside a pyramid. And it is in the secret part that there are these hints of the use of electricity. Did, for example, the pharaoh enter an enhanced electrical field when he went inside the pyramid? We can infer from the design of the Great Pyramid that the Egyptians were more than capable of creating a vibrational field. The choice of a gold leaf bed or a sarcophagus of alabaster or granite also had the advantage of being good conductors. Furthermore, before entering the burial chamber, the pharaoh put on a special garment, a keni garment, over his chest. This garment had a great ritual significance. It was believed to symbolize the embrace of Osiris and emphasize the role of the pharaoh as Horus king. But did it have a more mundane, practical function? Was its purpose also to protect his heart while in an electrical field? Now, the whole point of this burial ritual was for the pharaoh to have an out-of-body experience, for his soul to travel to astral plane. The texts talk of him flying up. Chapter 20 refers to the pharaoh rising into the sky like a mighty hawk. A stairway to the sky is set up for me, that I ascend on it to the sky. I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. The Egyptian pharaoh was in effect undergoing a shamanic journey in order to get answers, no different to modern shamans found today in the Amazon or Siberian steppes. The principles are the same. In the case of Egypt, the purpose of his mission was to download information to keep Egyptian civilization on track. And given how consistent Egypt remained over nearly 4,000 years, it could be said that the Egyptian pharaohs, shamans, were broadly successful. Like any other shaman, the pharaoh's journey had a destination. The pharaoh would aim for what the Egyptians called the fixed stars, the imperishable northern stars, or the never-resting stars. And these are called in Egyptian the Kemiuru and the Akhemi Urchi. And what is significant is that the names for these stars include the word chem and are more than likely a connection to what we call alchemy, which again Adrian was talking about yesterday. Now we think of alchemy as being some sort of primitive precursor to chemistry, nonsensical idea about transmuting lead into gold. But have we misunderstood? Where the confusion may have arisen is in the preparation of the substance that the pharaoh consumed before the secret part. And that quite possibly did involve gold, as in the alchemical gold, and electricity. Because what I haven't discussed in any detail was the Hetep ritual meal and its essential ingredient, the solar bread. What was the solar bread? Did it have special properties? In the Saqqara text, it is referred to as something that would help the pharaoh fly up. Did it have a connection to the cow goddess Hathor? She had a close association with gold. She had another name, which was Nubta, which means golden one. And there are many references to gold in the hieroglyphics around her temple at Dendera. She is the one charged with nurturing the soul of the pharaoh. Was she implicated in the preparation of the solar bread too? And was the solar bread made from a special powder? Is it a coincidence that Flinders Petrie found a vast quantity, more than 50 tons, of a mysterious white powder under slabs in the temple of Hathor at Serabit el-Kharimas in the Sinai? This reference to powder compares with the description of the philosopher's stone, again, which Adrian was talking about yesterday, the goal of every alchemist. A British alchemist writing in the 17th century, Irenaeus Philathus, who was known to Newton, Boyle, and Ashmole, says of the stone that it is gold, more pure than the purest. Its appearance is that of very fine powder. Was this the powder found in the Sinai? Was it the same as the philosopher's stone? Are the bread and the philosopher's stone the same thing? Muni Sadhu, writing in the late 1950s, also identifies the philosopher's stone as being a powder, and he mentions electricity. He talks of the first phase using a mineral called the magnesia of the sages. He goes on to state that what he calls the magnesia of the sages is a result of a mysterious operation involving the use of electricity or personal magnetism. And what is interesting to note that according to writer Lawrence Gardner, the gold used in ancient times was often of a very pure quality. One example he cites is the 4,000 Mesopotamian golden ram caught in the thicket, which can be seen today in the British Museum. It's not very big, it's like yay big. And we have examples of high quality in gold in Egypt too, such as this fine funeral mask of Tutankhamun. The Egyptians coated objects used for ritual in gold. Now, Gardner has postulated that the high quality of gold can only be achieved with the use of electricity, of electrolysis, because only that separates out the platinum group of metals from the gold. He explains that when an impure gold is exposed to high heat from a DC electric arc, there is first a flash of light, and then what is produced is a fine white powder, monatomic gold. So how did the Egyptians generate sufficient electrical charge for electrolysis? Lawrence Gardner invokes the use of the Ark of the Covenant, which he believes was an Egyptian device. This is a copy of one found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And Lawrence says it's a capacitor and a superconductor that could create the necessary charge. He cites references in the Bible to its destructive powers. For example, it kills Uzzah. And the need for a specially trained Levite priesthood who wore protective clothing, which included a breastplate called the ephod, very similar in design to the pharaoh's Kenny garment. The Levite priests are also given instruction to wash their hands and feet after contact with the ark, lest they die. That's in the Exodus. However true all this may be, there is no doubt the ancients knew how to produce small amounts of electrical charge. And as we know from Faraday establishing it in the 1830s, it is not difficult to achieve an electrical field because it occurs when a magnet is kept in motion near a coil of wire. And the Egyptians knew about magnets. They had access to gold from the Nubian desert, which contained magnetite. They had a term for a lodestone, which meant north-south iron, interestingly, res mehit bar. We also have examples of the 2,000-year-old so-called Baghdad battery, which is this thing up here. A small ceramic pot with an iron rod inside a copper cylinder. It was found in Iraq in the 1930s by Dr. Wilhelm Koenig, an Austrian archaeologist. And it was thought to be a galvanic cell capable of producing 1.5 to 2 volts. In addition, there are illustrations on Egyptian coffers of what appear to be a series of interconnected Leyden jars. I'm sorry about the quality of this picture, but they're here and they all connect. The Egyptologists could say they're perfume jars or something. People often wondered if the Egyptians didn't have some form of lighting because there are no examples of soot marks deep underground in the royal tombs in the Valley of Kings where the walls are highly decorated. And I'd like to return to Hathor, and particularly her temple at Dendra, which has a curious feature because it's here in the crypt that there are these famous reliefs that look like giant light bulbs. And several people have done reconstructions of these extraordinary images to show that they could be early forms of Crookes tubes or the Van Graaff generator. But I have now found what I think is a better explanation, and for which I am indebted to a member of the Thunderbolts Forum, William Armand Souza, who has kindly given me permission to reproduce his postings. He and his co-collaborator have done some amazing research and back engineering. Now, assuming that the images on the temple walls reveal ancient technology, William started his investigations with the hieroglyphs, which speak of the day and night baths, drawing down the energy from the sun, the lotus flower giving forth the sun of a new day. He wanted to know what all that meant in practical terms. So they set about reconstructing not just the Dendra light bulbs, but the Hathor sistrum. The Hathor sistrum is this. This is the Hathor sistrum. And the giant Menat necklace, which is this, which has got the Hathor sistrums on the top. And he believes these are electrical devices used to power the Dendra snake tube. The Dendra snake tube I showed you in the previous picture. He soon established that the Hathor sistrum, the rattle, this thing, is some sort of battery-powered electromagnetic buzzer, which he reconstructed here. And we see in this image the priestess sitting in a chair with a WYATT scepter, and this is being held out. This Hathor sistrum is being held out. And he describes this as being like a battery-powered electromagnetic induction coil. And he thinks that the WYATT scepter is trying to get some sort of charge from it. And the giant Menat necklace with 4 large sistrums, these ones, he thinks is some sort of big Tesla coil and was used to produce a high-voltage AC electricity to drive the snake bulbs, which are these things. And he decided that in the end that what these things are is they are some kind of violet ray healing device, and that the people are sat underneath them to acquire benefit. But what he discovered, he and his co-collaborator, that the snake tube images are actually stable, low-density plasma focus devices, where the lotus flower is the plasma focus. So I don't know if you can, this bit here. And the body of the snake is the Birkeland current, and that's a Z pinch, and the head of the snake is a plasmoid. And this is a photograph of what they finally managed to achieve as a result of their reconstruction. So I'll briefly describe how they made their discoveries. Their first thought was that the snake in the tube was somehow created by the Jed pillar. They tried everything, but nothing worked. Only later did they find out the function of the Jed pillar. After experimenting with different kinds of plasma, they finally settled on mercury, with its almost magical property of spontaneously creating a snake-like formation in the plasma. But even after discovering that the configuration was actually the plasma focus device, thus in theory connecting ancient Egyptian technology with the electric universe, they quickly realized they were facing some unresolved issues. First, there was what William calls the double tube power dilemma. The dendrous snake come in two configurations, single and double. Here we have the double one, here's the single one. With the assumption that the box under the table of the tube here, called the hay box, this bit down here, was the location of a flyback transformer, they determined that the cable going off to the lotus flower was a white high voltage lead, and that somewhere on the bottom, you can't see it in the images, is a black ground return lead. And sure enough, when they wired it up and tested the configuration, it worked exactly as expected. They fashioned a pair of copper knives and attached them to an acrylic stand, so to replace this. And that drew the snake out of the lotus flower, and they were happy with that. But in the double configuration there, they ran into a problem. They found that the right-hand tube did not light up. The left-hand one did, with its lotus flower connected to the black ground lead. And no second snake appeared. They tried various solutions, and eventually they found they needed a push-pull type of transformer in the hay box, with power leads delivering high voltage AC 180 degrees out of phase of each other. They achieved this by wiring two flyback transformers in series, such as their output signals were 180 degrees out of phase. The push-pull transformers worked well on the double snake configuration, where both snakes now leaped towards each other. And when they applied it to the single tube configuration, they found that the single snake was drawn out of the lotus flower with even more force, like a taut guitar string. So they were very happy about that. And the next was the rising snake dilemma. And it had to do with a problem they had encountered when they first created the plasma snake, because mercury plasma is repelled by earth-ground electrical potential. That ground repelling property caused the plasma snake to rise to the top of the tube. The solution to this problem turned out to be the cable from the hay box, the transformer, to the lotus flower. So this thing down here. And what they did, when the cable is put under the tube, as shown, the plasma snake is attracted to the power cable and drops naturally to the bottom of the tube. But that created a new problem. How did they get the snake to rise from the bottom of the tube and so match the snake in the images? They realized that the solution to this problem were the arms and hands of the jed pillar and the kneeling person on the hay box. They had finally found the function of the jed pillar by applying a variable adjustable earth ground potential using simple variable capacitor to the hands holding the tube, to this bit here, to here, which they assumed are made of some conductive material. They found they could lift the plasma snake off the bottom and adjust it to the middle of the tube, just as it's shown in the thing. They then found that if they placed objects on the power cable underneath, like the people kneeling in the images, the snake body would dip down slightly and create the snake-like waves we see. So to summarize, the flower petal ground problem, the lotus flower, the plasma focus, is made up of two electrically charged rings, an inner ring that is wired to the power cable, and an outer ring, the flower petals, that's connected to the earth ground, this bit here. There's no coaxial cable. There's an insulating cylinder between these cables, just a single high-voltage cable from the hay box to the lotus flower. The flower petals get their ground potential from the hand of the giants. This image doesn't show the hand, but there you can see the hand touching it. Now, in Bill's opinion, the plasmoid snakehead at the end of the Birkeland current is an example of a soliton, where the rapid collapse of the Birkeland current at the Z-pinch creates a chaotic soup of electromagnetic forces, gas particles and ions, which spontaneously creates a plasmoid soliton. And Bill goes on to quote the texts, "Ha somatus, the rising sun is carried by the jed to make the sunrise last eternal." He then says, what if the jed is somehow creating a lower hybrid drift waves in the plasma stream, and that is causing an acoustic-like cavitation in the plasmoid, the head of the snake. And it's this that creates and sustains an envelope soliton in the eye of the snake. Now, if Bill is correct, could this be an entirely new theory of how suns are formed? I wish he was here, because he'd really tell us more. As a big cavitation bubble in a plasmoid envelope. He has also written to me about his views on sonoluminescence. He says that at first he was disappointed to discover that sonoluminescence only happens in liquids, not in gases, and he later found that a plasma with its electrical magnetic properties acts like a liquid and can generate cavitation bubbles in a plasma under certain conditions. The lower hybrid drift wave phenomena, he says, causes magnetic bubbles to form in the tail of the Earth's magnetic field. Sonoluminescence is a key concept in his solar model. We'll have to bring him over for another conference. Now, talking of the stuff of life, I now have a truly controversial short thought to share with you that is entirely my own speculation. And this involves the proposition that the ancients who existed before the Egyptians were able to interfere with DNA deliberately with the genetic material of plants and animals, and that they deliberately domesticated plants and animals. Plants 10,000 years ago and animals 7,000 years ago. Now, what I'm going to describe now is an accidental experiment that took place in the 1980s in Switzerland, known as the Sibergi Experiments. And these, I think, give substance to my very out there proposition. As Rupert said, if we're going to be heretics, let's be truly heretics. Back in the 1980s, two Swiss researchers, Dr. Guido Ebner and Heinz Schursch, were working for pharmaceutical giant Sibergi, now Novartis, who also had an interest in agribusiness when they accidentally stumbled across an extraordinary phenomenon. Apparently Rupert knows about this because he's quoted in their website. What the researchers were doing there was exposing cereal seeds and fish eggs to an electrostatic field. This was a high-voltage DC field in which no current flows, a bit like lightning storm. The electric field strength of the electric static field is given in their patents in the following relation, wherein U signifies the voltage difference between the condenser plates and D is the plate distance. Particularly preferred is a voltage difference of 500 volts to 3,000. The plate distance of the condensers is preferably 1 centimetre to 50 centimetre. Now, the seeds or eggs were exposed only for a matter of days and then left to grow normally. The seeds were germinated with standardized light, temperature, and humidity. Nothing unusual there. The fish eggs returned to the aquarium. There were several outcomes of these experiments, some of which may have been anticipated, such as the increase in yield, faster growth, disease resistance, and it's probably for this last reason that the experiments were stopped in the early 1990s. Being a pharmaceutical company, Sibergi had no commercial interest in developing an alternative technique for disease resistance. And so it didn't rely on the sale of pesticides, which was their main business. But there was another result, and it's this result that was entirely unexpected, and this is this aspect that caught my attention. Because what they found is that the exposure to an electrostatic field charge resulted no less in the reversal of evolution. The cereals and fish reverted back to archaic forms, still present in the modern DNA. They described it as the retrieval of the existing gene. With the fish, a form of rainbow trout, what emerged was a giant trout. It even leapt out, and they had to build higher fences to keep it in. And it had been extinct in Europe for 130 years. It had more teeth, and in the case of the male, it had a mouth with hooks. Now, in terms of the wheat, because it's the wheat I'm going to focus on, it was smaller, with up to 12 ears per stalk and ready to be harvested in 4 to 6 weeks. A variant could be seen that had meadow grass-like arrangements of ear shoots and small narrow leaves, just like the earliest wheat. And it's my understanding that nobody's ever actually found some of the original wheat strains. They've sort of disappeared. It was as if these organisms were able to access their own genetic memories or their morphic resonance in the electric field. They could effectively create antecedents from progeny without using genetic engineering. Or as both researchers put it, our experiments do not involve the mutation of the organism in question, which in the case of genetic engineering involves the channeling of an additional gene into the organism. No entirely new organism is created. In the electrostatic field, only the gene expression is altered. the retrieval of the existing gene. That is something different. Now, the reason I've told you about these experiments is that I want to suggest to you something equally unthinkable. Were these experiments effectively back-engineering something that happened in the first place thousands of years ago? Because as I said at the beginning, ancient people were not primitive, they were not backward. So did an elite of ancient people deliberately use this kind of technique to create the improvements in species that we enjoy today? Focusing still on the example of wheat, because much of what we've been told about the early development of wheat in the Golden Crescent does not stack up. This just so you can get your bearings. This is the Mediterranean, this is Turkey, this is the Black Sea, this is Iran, this is Iraq, modern-day Iraq, this is ancient Mesopotamia with the first cities 5,000 years ago, the Balkans, Ukraine, up here. Now, much of my information on early wheat comes from the work of Professor Stephen Mithen, a professor of archaeology at Reading University in the UK, but not my interpretations. We are talking a time frame here of more than 10,000 years ago. These are my own interpretations. He's not involved. I've just used his base data rather than the interpretations. And we're talking about the emergence of einkorn, one of the early domesticated wheats. Professor Mithen, he cites the research of Professor Daniel Zohari, a botanist who was sadly now died, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And this Professor Zohari, he showed that the difference between a domesticated and wild edible grass is a difference of a single gene, one gene. Wild seed heads have what's called a brittle rachis, which is like a hinge. And this breaks and scatters on the wind, scattering the seeds. Domesticated variants wait. They wait to be picked. Another expert, Professor Gordon Hillman of University College London, has calculated that this rare genetic mutant, a non-brittle seed head, has a probability of occurring only once or twice in 2 to 4 million brittle seed heads. Very, very low probability. And that it would take at least 20 cycles for these non-brittle seed heads to finally dominate the crop. That could be, if you grew it once a year, 20 to 30 years. Now, just think for a moment, on a practical basis, why would anyone wait 20 to 30 years to feed their families? After all, people had been collecting and living off wild seed heads for thousands of years, because you can still eat them. Why would women, because Professor Hillman assumes it was women, suddenly begin to separate out so few plants? This doesn't make any sense to me. And there are other anomalous aspects too, such as the location of these plantings, where they occurred. And I won't go into that now. And similar anomalies apply to the domestication of animals. Why would anyone hang around a waterhole to work out which wild aurochs, supposing the aurochs are the basis of the modern cow, would make a good cow? How would you know what made a good cow? You cannot domesticate simply by penning up and hope to change the outcome of breeding. We still have wolves in zoos today. They haven't turned into dogs. Neolithic farmers had been penning up for meat and hides for thousands of years without producing a milkable cow. The milkable cow suddenly appears coincidentally with the first cities around 5000 BC, which is down there. And Professor Mithen comments that all animal species become reduced in size when the domesticated variants arise. And I have owned farm animals, so I'm also very aware of the fact that they also became conveniently, usefully docile. Because in the main thing, you don't want a big farm animal to know that it can kill you. You don't want them to know how dangerous they are. I've owned bulls and boars and big horses and all the rest of it. So in my opinion, the auroch cow was deliberately modified in order to serve the city and not the other way round. Cities were not built because cows became milkable. Cows became milkable because cities were built, and it wasn't a freak of nature. Now, I want to end my talk with some thoughts from Sir Isaac Newton, which may be relevant to the electric universe, often referred to as the father of science. Did he employ ancient Egyptian alchemical shamanic techniques to have out-of-body experiences, which helped him with his discoveries? He was, as we know from talking about him yesterday, highly secretive alchemist. He even blew up his rooms in Trinity College when his alchemical oven, his Athanor, caught fire. By the time of his death, Newton owned 138 books on pure alchemy, and when his papers were auctioned in 1936, 121 lots concerned alchemy. And would he have developed such a mechanistic interpretation of nature had it not been for the oppressive interest of the church in science? We should not forget the context in which Newton was born. Only 42 years after Giordano Bruno, who Adrian referred to yesterday, only 42 years after Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake for believing that stars were suns, things that we completely take for granted today. Mechanical interpretations are much easier to explain and much less dangerous. Newton also indicated privately that underlying processes might not have been mechanical. He would have been aware that some alchemists believed that matter and spirit were interchangeable. He thought that other principles might be at work, such as the idea of attraction at a distance. According to author Michael White, Newton came to perceive gravity as operating by action at a distance, made possible by a form of active principle. In an unpublished conclusion to his masterpiece Principia, he makes clear his view that a theory of attraction could be applicable to the microcosm as much as to the macrocosm. He states, For from the forces of gravity, of magnetism and of electricity, it is manifest that there are various kinds of natural forces. It is very well known that greater bodies act mutually upon each other. These are Newton's words. By those forces, and I do not clearly see why lesser ones should not act one another by similar forces. In his published work, Optics, he also raises a number of controversial opinions in the form of questions, including one that anticipates quantum physics. Query number 5 asks, do not bodies and light act mutually upon one another? That is to say, bodies upon light in emitting, reflecting, refracting, and inflecting it, and light upon bodies for heating them and putting their parts into vibrating motion wherein heat consists. And on that note, I'd like to end with a quotation from the 2nd century AD Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosopher. Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance, one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, how all things are the cooperating causes, all things which exist. Observe, too, the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. It is all connected. They knew that. So do we. It is an electric universe. Always has been. Always will be. Thank you.